The subject for this painting are these hills near where I live. What I liked about it were the rocks and the light, the afternoon light. I also liked that big oak tree at the top of the hill, catching some of the light as well. I used Photoshop to swap out the sky just to see what a different cloud formation would look like. Then I made a quick charcoal sketch of the scene. What I did was made some changes to the foreground. I added those two boulders there you see, and then changed the plant life a little bit. As you'll see later in the video, I stray from this quite a bit to complete the painting. So to start things off, I toned this panel. It's a 12.5 by 16 inch panel. I toned it with transparent red oxide acrylic and let that dry. Now I'm using my reference sketch and the photograph you see there in the upper left as my reference. And I'm just going to paint in some of the larger shapes using a burnt umber paint. All the paints I'm using are water mixable oils, mostly by Cobra, Royal Talons Cobra brand. I do have a Daniel Smith paint as well. I'll have a list here shortly. Again, what I'm doing here is really just brushing in the large shapes, the horizon, the top of the hill, the trees, some of the larger rocks, things like that. I'm not really going for anything finished, obviously, here. This is my guide or my skeleton that I will fill out later as I paint. I also use this technique to help determine and set tone or contrast. If I carry it far enough, I can use this as a no-tan for the painting. Here I'm wiping out areas that I painted in to represent foliage in the foreground. Now for the paint. I use titanium white, cadmium yellow medium, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, cadmium red light, quinacridone rose, violet, ultramarine blue, and viridian. These are my main paints for this painting. I do add a couple more as I go. So to begin with, I'm going to put in some of the darks, and I create the darks by mixing some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, and I can vary the hue between warm and cool depending on that mix. These are really the major dark areas, shadows and dark areas in the painting. I will put in some other smaller areas of dark paint later on in the process. Now I'm moving on to the sky with a mix of ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, and some titanium white. And I'm trying to keep this chunky and loose. I will go in later and smooth it out a bit because I find that it competed a bit with the craggy rocks in the painting. But for now, I'm just going to lay this in and we'll see how it goes. I generally like to also add in some yellow ochre or some other tone, some warmth to the sky, maybe even some violet, magenta, or red. I did not do that in this case because I do have the toned board behind, and you can see some of that show through. Now I'm going to work on that distant horizon, the hills there in the distance. I'm using some violet and some of the ultramarine blue and white mixture as well. And I'm going to lighten that as I come down to the bottom of that area, just to show some atmosphere. And that'll all get blended and blurred later. Now I'm going to mix up a variety of greens with the viridian, the Cad Red Light to knock it back just a little bit, and some of the Cad Yellow medium. I also put some ultramarine blue in there. So I've got three piles here. I've got a light green, and then I've got a warm green and a cool green. The goal here is to paint in these oak trees with as few brush strokes as possible. I want to convey the trees, the age, the size, and the fact that they're in the light, but I don't want too much detail. I want to leave enough looseness there to engage the viewer. Now I'm putting in some of the sky holes with the blue left over from doing the sky earlier. I'm adding in the secondary trees and bushes along the top there. And again, with just enough detail to say tree, but not so much that it describes it completely. I'm putting in the rocks up at the top there, but I do decide to come back later and alter that look. I need to add more detail, more contrast to it, and I'll do that later in the video. Now these rocks here in the middle ground were something that I put in the sketch. And while it looked decent in the sketch, I don't really care for the look in the painting itself. I believe it just draws too much attention. It becomes a focal point in itself. And I want that focal point to be up at the top of this hill here. So I'll put it in, but you'll see that I rub it out later. Along with all of this that I'm putting in here, these plants, this dark gray muddy color here that I'm putting in the foreground, all of this is going to get rubbed out later, but I thought I'd leave it in just to show the process. Now you see me putting in some earth tones, more greens and some yellows in the foreground, middle ground. It's fairly abstract and loose. Last night, I passed by the painting, came downstairs to the studio, passed by this painting and thought, you know, I just want to make a little tweak to the clouds. And that was all I was going to do. I wasn't going to set up the video camera and turn the lights on and do any of that. It was just kind of late. I thought, I just want to tweak this before it dries, and I'll explain on the video when I start recording again. So an hour later, I've made some changes. So I'm going to try to describe what I did and then continue on from there. I did soften the clouds because I thought the sky was fighting a bit with the rocks and some of the abstract areas of the painting. So I softened them a bit. I didn't add any paint. I just used one of these right here, a badger brush, fan brush, and just went back and forth on a few of the areas. And then what that did is it softened some of the sharp edges, removes some of the brush marks, but not all of them, as well as softening this horizon of the distant hills here. So that pushes that back and brings this forward. Then I just kind of got into it. So like I said, I spent an hour. So what I did is I used some dark and light paint to increase the contrast of the stones up here, the boulders. I wanted that to be more craggy and more contrasty. So I worked on those for a while, as well as down here. I continued the line of the stones down here and worked on the shading here. And as I continued down, I thought, you know, I need a path. I want to bring the viewer into the painting somehow. So I rubbed out a path here and then worked on the foreground, adding a little bit more random details, a little more texture to it. It was pretty soft before. I want the view to come in here and then end up here. So I added some texture, some weeds and grass and things like that. Started to anyway, and then over here as well. I still have a little bit of work to do there, and obviously I need to work on this path. I thought this path was kind of neat. I like the dividing of it. You can go that way or you can go this way. I'll probably make this side more subtle. We'll see how that goes. And then bring the viewer up into it here. Also over here, softened a lot of the stones that I had put in here. I didn't think they needed to be defined. Just have some value differences here. And then softened this hill a bit. There's a little bit of a stone boulder buried in the side of the hill there. I think that's plenty. All right, so that's what I did. All that in about an hour, hour and a half, something like that last night. So I'm going to continue now, and we'll see how this goes. Okay, now I'm going to put this path in at the bottom using a variety of grays, warm and cool, trying to keep that variation going. Makes it more interesting to look at. And then I'm going to shape it a little bit with more of the greens on the side. As I paint this path, it's starting to look like a creek or a brook. So I need to put some earth tones in there. Okay, I'm going to call this one done. My goal here was to add in a little bit of a path. It's sort of a suggested path. Here it's obvious, but once you get here, it sort of dissolves away. Maybe there's a little bit here, who knows? And then beyond that, it just disappears. And also a little bit of a right-hand turn here. If this plant wasn't here or this grass wasn't here, you'd see more of the path. Then I also simplified some of this area over here. I took out some of the hard-edged rocks, and then I blended some of this here, adding what looks like maybe a buried boulder over on the right-hand side here. I added in some texture in the foreground, weeds, grass, things like that. It's really just a bunch of noise, abstract noise. If you look at it isolated, it wouldn't look like much of anything. So we've got this path that takes you up to the top here, the payoff here, the rocks, the higher contrast, the harder edge, and then we've got some more detail as well in the trees and the rocks. So I think all together it works pretty well. Thank you for watching, and if this is something you enjoy, please subscribe and like, and we'll see you on the next painting. Bye.